shall get started with our program. Welcome, everyone. My name is Raja Khoury. I'm CEO of Khoury Conversations, and I welcome you all to today's webinar titled, What Next for Palestinian Leadership? A conversation with Khaled Al-Gindi. Welcome, Khaled. It's great to have you with us here from DC. We will start our program as usual with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on indigenous land and territories, known and unknown. We respect indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. As settlers and immigrants, we recognize that we have an active role in reconciliation. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the Ottawa Forum in Israel-Palestine and their chair, Peter Larson, for sponsoring today's Zoom platform. And of course, the biggest thanks go to our participants today coming to us from Canada, the US, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. And lastly, as many of you would know, Khoury Conversations are not about debates. They're not about winners and losers. They're about, insight and understanding. And we almost always end these conversations without any casualties. The format today is very simple. It's conversational. I will have a chat with Khaled about Palestinian leadership, a little bit of history, and then what we have currently and what the prospects for the future are. And then we will open the floor for questions from you. This session is being recorded, and the chat box is open, but not for questions. Your questions should be put in the Q&A box because that's where we'll be looking. Okay, a few words to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Khaled Al-Gindi is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs Middle East Institute's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He is the author of the newly released book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump, published by Brookings Institution Press in 2019. Al-Gindi previously served as a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution, and prior to that, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009. And he was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 2008. Al-Gindi is also an adjunct instructor in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. His writings have appeared in a wide range of publications, from the Christian Science Monitor to CNN.com, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Times, etc. He is frequently quoted in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Hill, Politico, and other print media. He's a regular commentator on TV and radio, including Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and yes, all of them. He's been in all of these as a spokesperson whose expertise is in the region, and particularly, Palestinian affairs and Palestinian leadership and constitution. Okay. Well, Khaled, thank you very much for being with us today. It's for years we've been watching, an ineffectual Palestinian leadership, political leadership in the West Bank and in Gaza. In talking to Palestinians who live there, they've pretty much, given up on this leadership and don't even want to deal with them because they're corrupt, ineffective, and basically useless. That's what we hear from people over there. Of course, Palestinian leadership has had better days. I'd like to recall the days of the PLO from 1965 to 1982 were, in my mind at least, the PLO, despite many mistakes and engaging in violence against civilians, had some serious achievements. The main three to me are basically bringing all the Palestinian factions under one umbrella, and that wasn't an easy task. And Yasser Arafat, like Haiti, managed to do that. The second one being that the PLO managed to gain the respect of the world as being the voice of the Palestinian people, as the official representative of the Palestinian people. And thirdly, PLO managed to stay independent of all the other Arab regimes who tried to co-opt it and control it and pull strings and so on. And again, Yasser Arafat managed to maintain the independence of the PLO. So it did have a history of achievement up until 1982, at least, when the PLO was expelled from Lebanon and basically became, an exile in Tunisia. So starting, and we don't want to dwell too much on the history, but starting on this evaluation that I made, and that's my own, and I'm no expert. What's your take on what I said?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with your group. I just want to point out before going further that several people are noting that there's an echo, so I don't know if the sound issue has been resolved.
There's no echo on you, Khaled. It was when Raja was speaking.
I see. Okay. I think your assessment of the PLO's achievements is accurate and fair, and the things that you described are it's no small feat that the PLO is able to establish itself, to take these disparate groups in exile with no territorial base, and to carve out a national movement made up of different components of Palestinian constituencies that were scattered both inside the homeland and outside. That's a very difficult thing to do. If you just look at, for example, the Syrian opposition movement in exile or the Libyan opposition since 2011, they have been very unsuccessful in carving out a similar kind of a national movement or government in exile, or however we want to look at it. So, and then to be able to do that and put the Palestinian issue on the international agenda within a very short period of time from the PLO's creation in 1965, but also more importantly from the moment that the Palestinian factions took over the PLO and made it a genuinely autonomous and representative Palestinian entity, which was in 1969 that happened. So from 1969 until the PLO was recognized at the United Nations in 1974, in late 1974, that is a very big achievement in a pretty short period of time. The one unfulfilled thing that, for the PLO, their peak was in the 1970s and 80s, and they were, obviously there were setbacks, the defeat in Lebanon, and that really fractured the movement afterwards, but it remained a legitimate force in the eyes of Palestinians inside Palestine and outside. The one thing it hadn't been able to achieve was to earn a place in the peace process. It had been since the 1970s trying desperately to earn a seat in the peace process, which of course was dominated by the United States. And it took until, it took an uprising in the late 1980s and early 90s before the PLO was allowed to have a dialogue with the United States, but was still not part of the peace process until the secret deal between Israel and the PLO in 1993 in Oslo. And then that led to US recognition of the PLO. But it's interesting that it came as a surprise to the United States and was outside of a US role. In any case, I mean, we've come a long way since then. The PLO is a shell of its former self. Of course, it's complicated by the fact that the PLO itself was kind of dismantled and then reincarnated in the form of this new entity after Oslo called the Palestinian Authority, and that the PLO was sort of cannibalized to create the institutions, the governing institutions of the PA in the post-Oslo period. But it remained as the international address of the Palestinian national movement, but in a much less representative, much less coherent, and much less effective form. And now we're seeing the Palestinian Authority going through the same stages of decline that we saw happen with the PLO in the 1980s and 90s, and now we're seeing the same thing happen with the PA. It's running out of money. It is chronically on the verge of financial bankruptcy. It is unelected. It is increasingly repressive, and there are serious questions about its legitimacy. I mean, right now, Mahmoud Abbas is, as the embodiment, of course, he is not the only aspect of the Palestinian Authority, but he's a clear, he's the leader, he's the president of the PA and chairman of the PLO Executive Committee, and yet he is extremely unpopular, and it's difficult to exaggerate just how unpopular he is. Over the past 6 years, we've seen poll after poll after poll that the majority of Palestinians inside the occupied territories want him to resign. I think that number reached about 80% this year. So,
the post-Oslo era, in my mind at least, there is the Arafat years and then the Abbas years. I know there's echo in the sound, and I don't know what to do about it. It's never happened before. And so if you sort of quickly tell us what is the difference between these two eras, and was it a continuous decline, or was there a different kind of decline after Arafat?
It's a good question. It's kind of a mixed bag in my view. There is a lot of continuity. Certainly the decline began under Yasser Arafat and continued under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. But these are two very different leaders. Yasser Arafat was a charismatic leader. He was viewed almost universally as the godfather of the national struggle. He was revered and respected by all political factions, including Hamas. It's probably more in death than while he was alive. But if you go to Hamas headquarters in Gaza, you will see on the wall behind any Hamas figure portraits of not of Mahmoud Abbas, but of Sheikh Yassin and of Yasser Arafat, as Sheikh Yassin being the spiritual father of Hamas as a movement, and of course the martyr president, as many Palestinians refer to him, Yasser Arafat. So he was able to keep the movement together almost by the force of his personality. And he was also quite adept at playing politics in the Arab world. As you pointed out, he did a very good job of keeping the PLO relatively independent, it's a mammoth task when you consider that there were inside this umbrella of the PLO, there were factions that were supported by Syria, by Iraq, by Libya, by the Egyptians, by, everyone pretty much in the region had their hand inside one PLO faction or another. And he was able to balance those internal rivalries and maintain relationships with Arab states, from conservative Gulf states to more, let's say, revolutionary or radical states like in the Ba'ath Party in Syria or Iraq, or others. I mean, he was the embodiment of the Palestinian national movement. He knew how to use the Palestinian issue with Arab domestic opinion. So if he wasn't getting something from a particular Arab leader, he knew how to sort of circumvent that or use kind of soft power to influence public opinion back home, to ultimately pressure Arab regimes to do certain things. And so many Arab leaders disliked him, but they couldn't ignore him. And that's not true of Mahmoud Abbas. Many Arab leaders dislike him and have no problem ignoring him. There's almost no one in the region who he could call an actual friend or ally. The closest thing that he has to an ally is King Abdullah in Jordan. And that is really because of the interconnection between Jordanian and Palestinian strategic interests and the inseparability of, the fact that, Jordan has a Palestinian majority, the fact that Jordan plays a role in the holy places in Jerusalem. They have a direct stake, they have a border. Of course, it directly affects their security, water issues. And so it's impossible really to separate the Jordanians from the Palestinian issue. But other than that, he doesn't have many friends.
So one last question, Khaled, before we sort of look at the situation today. You said the decline started after Oslo at the hands of Arafat. And was that because of Oslo itself, or like what happened? How did that happen?
Well, technically, I would say the decline of the PLO began probably after Lebanon in 1982,
Sure.
Because that's when we see real fragmentation of the Palestinian movement. We have kind of mini civil war happening between factions. Even Fatah itself was divided between pro and anti-Arafat, militias who were fighting each other. And then there were, of course, the anti, sort of the rejectionist front, who were, quite vocal and militant in their opposition to Arafat, who was quite pragmatic in his leadership in terms of a diplomatic process, in terms of overtures to Israel and the Americans and so forth. And so the decline really began, I think, in the 1980s. And then they got a little bit of a boost from the Intifada, because it suddenly made the Palestinian issue front and center on the international agenda, and the PLO could be the face again of the Palestinian national movement. And they did that effectively, but then the Gulf War came, and that weakened them further because of the appearance that the PLO had sided with Saddam Hussein. And of course, the Gulf states were some of the PLO's main funders. And so they lost that funding from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. And so they were, greatly weakened by that. And ultimately, it was that weakness, especially after the US ended its dialogue rather abruptly with the PLO in 1990, I think it was. isolated, they were weak, they were financially strapped. And so Oslo comes about in that environment of PLO weakness. And it is a way for the PLO to come out from underneath that weakness. Oslo was a lifeline. And partly, part of the reason why the PLO ended up agreeing to things that a lot of people now look at, with raised eyebrows, like Area A, B, and C, and things that have been really kind of nightmarish for Palestinians on the ground. But they agreed to these things out of out of weakness, and so for a while in the prime of the Oslo years, which wasn't really long, it was probably 1994 was the peak of Oslo, and maybe 1995. But after that, it was really downhill. The Oslo process stalled when Rabin was murdered, and then Netanyahu was elected, and then of course we had the Intifada, and so it's been one setback after another. And so they never really kind of got their bearings, during the Oslo process. And so we've just seen, it hasn't been a linear decline, but it has been steady over time.
And of course, Oslo put everything in the hands of the United States, and the Palestinian leadership had only this one place where it can be and function, and that's of course very limiting.
It's very notable because the Oslo changed everything. We shifted from the PLO being the center of gravity to the PA. That had huge implications for the diaspora and for refugees in particular. The PA, of course, refugees have no stake in the PA because it's only operating inside the occupied territories. And it was never intended to be a representative government. It was an administrative body that was going to run things in the interim until such time as a Palestinian state would come into being. And that state would be the merger of the PLO and the PA. And that state never happened. And so it was kind of in this suspended state of evolution. But what's really notable about the Oslo period and really ever since then, as we said, Arab states were central to the PLO's survival throughout its history, financially, and for the most part, there were no strings attached. They didn't have, they weren't audits of the money coming from Kuwait to the PLO. They didn't necessarily want to know, is this being used in a transparent way? And so that gave Arafat a lot of freedom to, pursue his own patronage networks and so forth. You compare that to the Oslo process, right? This is another big shift that happened after Oslo. Is the Palestinian leadership went from having mostly Arab patrons, the Arab states being their base of support and financial support, to the United States and Western donors and Israel being central to the PA's survival. And those donor states, and especially Israel, Israel isn't a donor per se, but they collect taxes from Palestinians and transfer them to the PA, at least they're supposed to.
Yeah.
And that dependency on the US, on Israel, on the Europeans, comes with a lot of strings, way more strings than the PLO ever had with Arab states, right? They didn't have to report back on how they were using those funds. And so it's been much more restricting for this leadership. And now we're seeing not only, Congress, I heard this recently from a congressional staffer who basically confirmed what my own intuitive sense, but the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the single most legislated foreign policy issue in the United States Congress, okay? The vast majority of those pieces of legislation are sanctions on the Palestinians, are conditions, are hoops that Palestinians have to jump through, or sanctions, or some kind of punitive measure. And so the Palestinians are essentially the most sanctioned people on earth when it comes to the U.S. Congress. So it's in that sense, it's interesting. It's the exact opposite of the U.S.-Israel relationship, right? Which comes with zero conditions of any kind. But the point is, these outside groups have an enormous say. The Israelis, the Americans, the Congress, others have an enormous say in internal Palestinian affairs in ways that the Arab states never did. And that has been further weakening, and that has really damaged the credibility and legitimacy of this Palestinian leadership, which many Palestinians see as more responsive to the US and donor countries than to their own people. And that's the structural problem that Oslo has created.
Right.
There is an inherent tension between the legitimacy of this Palestinian leadership and their ability there's a kind of inverse relationship between their legitimacy domestically and their legitimacy vis-a-vis the US and Israel.
So it's not all the fault of the leadership. The structure itself is diminishing on its own. But on top of that, they've been incompetent and corrupt to a large extent.
I think that's fair.
What would you say about the other Palestinian political leadership, Hamas in Gaza, and of course to the West, Hamas is dismissed as a terrorist organization, but to Palestinians, it's a lot more than that. It's really it's seen as the last sort of defense against Israeli oppression or aggression. What is your view of that leadership?
I mean, Hamas, yes. I mean, it's a kind of a mixed bag, because Hamas is, as you said, it's viewed as by the international community mostly as a terrorist organization. So by law, the U.S. and the Europeans can't deal with them. They can't fund things, obviously, and not just in Gaza, but when Hamas was part of the government of the full PA after 2007, briefly, it had to boycott. The international community boycotted the entire PA government in the West Bank and Gaza because of Hamas's presence. So that's a very serious complicating factor. But Hamas has its own sources of legitimacy. The fact that Hamas is still engaged in armed struggle, and that they are seen as, among other things, for example, as the defenders of Al-Aqsa Mosque. So when the Israeli forces storm Al-Aqsa, like they did a few weeks ago and like they did last year in the period just before the Gaza war, Hamas could make a show of saying, look at, not in so many words, but in comparison to the leadership in Ramallah that could do nothing other than issue statements, Hamas responded with rockets, and they said, we are defending Al-Aqsa Mosque. And of course, Gaza Palestinians paid a very heavy price over that 11 days of Israeli bombardment. But they got a huge boost in their popularity because they are seen as the only ones who are able to make Israel pay a cost for the occupation, even when it is beyond their reach. Right? They can't reach Jerusalem directly, but they've developed a very sophisticated arsenal of missiles that over the years, they used to just be kind of, overblown firecrackers in the early days in the 2000s. And now there are sophisticated missiles that can reach almost any population center in Israel. And so they are seen as a force that can make Israel pay a cost. The problem is, one, the international community won't deal with them. Two, they don't really have a vision beyond that. In the same way, I mean, they're sort of a one-trick pony. In the same way that Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah are a one-trick pony in the West Bank, they only do negotiations, right? That's their whole political program, is a negotiated two-state solution, blah, blah, blah. And we still hear them talking about the quartet and, all these obsolete and irrelevant entities. And so that's clearly ineffective. But also, if you're with Hamas, if your only thing you have is armed struggle, but you have got no political diplomatic strategy or a strategy for putting the Palestinian movement back together because it's broken, it's divided, not just the split between Hamas and Fatah, but it's deeply fragmented on many, many levels. And someone, more like someone's, there needs to be some multilateral pan-Palestinian effort to put the movement back together to make it coherent, because it's totally ineffective if one group is off doing negotiations or that's their sole agenda and the other group is only doing armed struggle. And then you've got in civil society people doing nonviolent popular resistance, like the March of Return, or sometimes we see it crop up in Jerusalem and other places. They're just all over the place. And so you've got, you need to have a national movement with coherent strategy, with a coherent set of goals. It needs to be organizationally coherent. There might be a delegation of division of labor, but it's got to all be serving the same purpose, and nobody's doing that. And so in a lot of ways, Hamas is guilty of the same problem as Fatah. It's just sort of the other side of the coin.
So okay, what next? Are we just waiting for Mahmoud Abbas to pass on? I mean, he's in his late 80s, I think now. Is that the only hope going forward, is for him to pass on and someone else take his place, and maybe that person can provide that kind of leadership?
I mean, I would say that the eventual passing of Mahmoud Abbas is an opportunity for something to get unstuck, right? To take because it will necessarily move things. There's going to have to be some kind of succession process, and so a lot of people see it as a way to get over this state of paralysis. But it's also very risky, because there's going to be a power struggle within Fatah, which now has at least 3 or 4 factions
Within Fatah.
Within Fatah, which is one of the key reasons that Abbas canceled elections a year ago, was because he had at least 3 different Fatah lists running in the elections up against Hamas's one unified, disciplined electoral list. And so, you don't have to be an electoral genius to figure out that you're going to hurt your electoral chances that way.
Would have been a landslide for Hamas.
Yeah, and it's similar to what they did in 2007, where you had Fatah candidates running against each other, and then of course Hamas could come in. Fatah vote was divided, even if it was going to be a plurality or a majority. Dividing the Fatah vote allowed Hamas to dominate, and so this is another consequence of Mahmoud Abbas's, I think, failed leadership. Yasser Arafat would have done a much better job of imposing internal discipline within his Fatah movement. Mahmoud Abbas's response, so Yasser Arafat was not a Democrat. He had very strong authoritarian impulses, but one thing he was very good at was consensus building. He always had, was balancing different forces within his own party, between factions, giving people a little bit of what they wanted in return for something else. Mahmoud Abbas doesn't do that. He doesn't take any sort of dissent. If you disagree with his style of leadership, you are effectively excommunicated. Not just someone like Mohammed Dahlan, but also someone like Nasser al-Qudwa, who is also now facing the same fate. And before him, Yasser Abd Rabbo, who was quite close to both Abbas and Yasser Arafat. And so his style is, if you oppose me, I excommunicate you. Well, that just breeds factionalism and division, because people need an outlet to express their dissatisfaction.
A lot of questions are coming in now, Khaled, and people are interested in the future. How can this Palestinian leadership be saved? What are constructive steps going forward? What happened to the Palestine National Council? It used to play an important role. Can that be resuscitated? After Abbas, are there figures in the background on the scene who could provide a much better unifying leadership going forward? Because until that happens, there is really no hope for anything else to happen.
It's true. I mean, people often ask me what can be done on the Israeli-Palestinian scene or in the diplomatic sphere, and my answer is nothing. I mean, none of that matters. If the quartet convenes new negotiations tomorrow, it's pointless. Yeah. If Biden says, I'm hosting the leaders for an emergency peace summit at Camp David, it's pointless. Until Palestinians can put their own house in order, there's just no way any diplomatic process can succeed. And we've seen it over and over again, because all it takes is one Hamas rocket to end whatever new process emerges. And we saw it in 2008. We saw it. It's like Groundhog Day. We see it over and over. And so, yes, this is the most important thing, I think, is for Palestinians to put their own house in order. As I said, I think Abbas's departure is an opportunity, but it comes with risks. It's not inconceivable that we could see a kind of Fatah could unify, not necessarily around a single leadership, but maybe something like a rule by committee where everybody gets something. The Dahlan faction gets something, the Qudwa faction gets something, the Rajub faction gets something, the old Abbasists might get something, to sort of keep Fatah together. And it's not inconceivable to imagine a new arrangement between Hamas and Fatah and the other factions. Is there an individual on the horizon that is a kind of unifying force? I can only think of one, and that's Marwan Barghouti, who is who's in jail, right, serving multiple life sentences in an Israeli jail, but he has the military credentials, he has the political credentials, he is he's well respected across political factions. He's the only figure that I see in Palestinian politics who is supported by Hamas people, Fatah people, regardless of which faction of Fatah, by the leftists, by secular, religious, young, old. he's the only figure that commands that kind of credibility. But of course, he's in jail, and so that there are practical impediments to him ruling over a movement, much less an authority that he's physically not present in. But he could be something like a symbolic leader. You know, I could imagine a scenario where he becomes leader of the PLO, right? And because he's this unifying figure, and then the PA is, you know, there have to be an election for the PA, unlike the PLO. So, I mean, this is another problem with succession, is that we're not talking about one succession process. We're talking about at least two, maybe three, because the PA's got one process, the PLO has a different one. And then, of course, Fatah would need a new leadership as well. And right now, all three hats are worn by one person. That won't be the case in the future, because there's no one person who has that kind of credibility. And so we are going to see, I think, in a post-Abbas era, the person who leads the PLO is not going to be the president of the Palestinian Authority, is not going to necessarily be the leader of Fatah. And so that also creates opportunities for more power sharing and horse trading, but it's also difficult to maintain.
People are asking about the Abraham Accords, and of course, you know, the Abraham Accords were viewed very positively by Israelis and you know, Jewish communities in the diaspora, as you know, Israel establishing relations with a number of Arab countries. Of course, from the Palestinian side, you know, this idea of normalization with Israel, with nothing in return, with no gains for the Palestinians, is seen as a, you know, as a selling up the Palestinian cause. So the question is, can the Abraham Accords actually become a positive factor in making peace in the future?
Theoretically, maybe. As a practical matter and as a political matter, I don't see that happening, because I don't see anyone pushing in that direction. I mean, we hear a lot about, you know, the UAE or other Arab countries that have normalized with Israel. They could use their newfound influence in that relationship to pressure Israel on settlements, on Jerusalem, on Gaza. Okay, yeah, that exists in theory, but we've not seen any inclination by the UAE or any other government to use that sort of leverage. On the contrary, what we've seen is when problems arise, it's not you know, when something happens in Jerusalem, you don't see the UAE or Morocco stepping in to say, let's mediate this, or, you know, we can have some influence here and calm things down. What they tend to do is sort of retreat into the background and kind of, you know, hope that it passes quickly, because it's an embarrassment. Because they're, you know, just last week they were hosting an Israeli delegation of some sort, and so they need to lay low to let the storm pass. We don't see the UAE pressuring Israel on anything. We do see them inviting delegations of Israeli settlers to come and do business in the UAE. We saw, you know, in the lead up to the Abraham Accords, the way they were handling the issues, the very delicate issues in Jerusalem, like the status quo arrangement that has, you know, been in place for many years. They didn't show a lot of understanding or appreciation for the status quo. You know, they're not particularly, in other words, they're not particularly interested in using that leverage. At least we've not seen them use that leverage or attempt to in any way. We see them instead doing business with Israeli settlers. So yeah, that leverage exists in theory. But the other problem also is the whole point of the Abraham Accords, if we take Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu at their word, was to marginalize the Palestinian issue. So it's not a, it's not a bug, it's not a flaw, right? It's by design. The Abraham Accords was designed in part to circumvent the Palestinians and to marginalize the issue, and that's exactly what it did. And so it, further weakened the Palestinians and further, marginalized their issue. So to try and spin it, to rebrand the Abraham Accords as a way of putting the Palestinians back in the center, I think requires a lot of mental gymnastics. And so, I've heard the arguments, they're just not convincing given everything that we've seen.
And I suppose the fact that these accords happened was an indication of the weakness of the Palestinian leadership, that Arab leaders can go ahead and completely disregard Palestinian interests and do what they want for their own special interests. And I don't suppose this could have happened under Arafat, would it?
I mean, it's a different region than it existed then, so it's a bit of a counterfactual, and it's possible. I mean, what caused this new alignment of interests between Arab Gulf states and Israel, I think had a lot to do with the Arab Spring and Iran, of course, and the fact that the Arab Spring turned into a winter and is one more thing that allowed Iranian influence to expand in the region in places like Yemen and Syria and Iraq, to fill the vacuum left by these failed or failing states. And so, Iran has loomed very large at the very same time that the Arab Spring has gone sour, and that's created the geopolitical conditions for this new alignment in the region, and also the fact that the US is retreating from the region. And so regional powers are looking to each other to create a new security architecture of some kind. And, and that means in a way, Arab states and Israel coming together to confront the Iranian threat or to confront. I also happen to think that this alliance between Israel and Gulf states in particular is also a response to the Arab Spring in ideological terms, in the sense that the Arab Spring produced movements clamoring for democracy. It created opportunities for Islamist political movements to gain power in Egypt and Tunisia and pretty much most places where there was any free elections. And those are a threat to these authoritarian regimes. They don't want to see democracy spreading across the region. And so there is, I think, an ideological component attached to the Abraham Accords, in the sense that it is also, I think, an authoritarian, it is an axis of authoritarianism.
Thanks, Khaled. We have a down-to-earth practical question here from, sounds like he's an ally. The question is, in the complete absence of Palestinian leadership, what do we supporters of Palestinian rights do?
I mean, it's a good question, and I think the answer, it's hard because you need a political address. You know, in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, you could point to the ANC. They had a political program, one person, one vote, end to apartheid. That was something that it had legitimacy because you could pinpoint it. You don't have that now with the Palestinian leadership, or at least you don't have a coherent political program. But I think certain things are still, people can still demand accountability. People can still demand respect for Palestinian human rights, and that all sides be held accountable, whether it's Hamas launching rockets at population centers or Israeli army committing war crimes. There needs to be accountability for all of these things. The murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, where this famous question that the State Department spokesman Ned Price keeps getting, and that is, where do Palestinians go to get justice? Well, we know they can't go to the Israeli courts, right? Because the Israeli courts, among other things, have rubber stamped the expulsion of thousands of Palestinians from their homes in Masafer Yatta and other places, right? So that's not a credible place. Maybe it's the International Criminal Court. Maybe it's the UN inquiry of, from the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. There are other mechanisms in the absence of a political leadership that people could point to and say, at a minimum, maybe a political solution isn't around the corner, whether you believe in one state or two states or some sort of hybrid. In the meantime, you still have to protect people, their lives, their rights, their ability to move around in their own country. And this is where the focus ought to be. The Biden administration has this line that is pretty new as far as US policy is concerned, but it's not really clear what it means. And that is, they keep talking about Israelis and Palestinians deserve equal measures of freedom, security, liberty, prosperity, and so forth. Okay, that's a really nice formula, but what does it mean in practice? How do we get to a place where there's equal measures of security? Well, we know it doesn't exist. Israelis have security. They've got an army. They're a nuclear power. They have this massive deterrent force. They have massive firepower. Army can go in and arrest whoever it wants, whenever it wants, right? So they can get accountability. How do Palestinians get accountability? How do they get security? It's up to the international community. And I wish I had a better answer, but I think the call has to be, there needs to be accountability, there needs to be respect for Palestinian rights until such time as a political solution happens, because it might be 5, 10, 20, another 50 years. Palestinians' rights shouldn't be dependent on the diplomatic stars aligning. But yes, it would help greatly if Palestinians had a leadership that could articulate that more effectively.
We have 2 minutes left, so quickly, there are signs that grassroots leadership among the Palestinians in North America, let's look at the U.S. in particular, have been making inroads in aligning themselves with the Black Lives Matter and other social justice and kind forces. Is there a hope in hell that some shift, gradual perhaps, in American policy towards the area? Or
there is a shift. There is definitely a shift happening in American public opinion, and it's filtered up into the political realm as well, mostly inside the Democratic Party. If you look at the polls, it's pretty stark. The vast majority, basically the picture is an inversion of what it was 20 years ago. The Democratic Party was historically the pro-Israel party. I can remember, I'm old enough to remember in the 1980s, the handful of pockets of criticism of Israel were coming mainly from Republicans. Chuck Percy, Paul Findley, Jim Baker when he was Secretary of State. That Republican Party doesn't exist anymore. And now the Democratic Party also has shifted. But at a grassroots level, you know, it used to be like, you know, the standard question, do you sympathize more with Israelis or Palestinians? It was maybe 3-1, 4-1 in favor of Israel, okay? Today, that picture is reversed. A majority of people who identify as Democrats are more sympathetic to Palestinians than Israelis. That is an earthquake inside the Democratic Party, and we're seeing it reflected only among progressives in terms of policy and, you know, political rhetoric and the discourse, but eventually it's probably going to make its way up into the leadership, especially as a new generation of leaders come in. So there's a huge gap between where the Democratic Party leadership is, the Bidens and the Pelosi's and the Schumers and the Ted Deutsches are still reading from the AIPAC script, almost verbatim. But the up and coming at a grassroots level, certainly that's no longer the case. And so either the party is going to be perpetually at odds with its base, or it's going to have to reconcile that gap somehow and allow for a discourse that is more respectful of Palestinian rights and Palestinian sensibilities and so forth. But we're still a ways from that actually happening.
Khaled, we're out of time, unfortunately. I can't thank you enough. This has been so informative, enlightening, and at the same time, to some extent, hopeful. You know, looking at the situation does not inspire hope often, but maybe there is hope. Maybe there is hope in the end, and I have a feeling we will talk again in about a year. Maybe things would have changed, and we will compare notes. I can't thank you enough for spending the time with us and sharing your insights. And thank you to all of our participants here. We plan to take a break over the summer from these conversations, but you know, if things do happen, and they often do, then we will arrange for something to take place. Happy summer, everyone, and we'll see you again in the fall. Khaled, thanks again, and thank you.
Thanks for having me, and enjoy the rest of your week.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.